As I said, thank you very much. We'll stay with tech now, and very pleased to welcome to the stage Maya Hari, Vice President, Asia Pacific at Twitter. Now, if you go to Twitter and you press the About button, because I did that, this is what you get. Twitter is what's happening in the world and what people are talking about right now. I spent most of my career in the media. People would talk about a media storm. They now talk about a social media storm, which is normally a debate on Twitter, whether it's the US president announcing policy changes, whether it's a showbiz story, whether it's sport. It seems to all happen on Twitter, and it is a source of news, source of information. But what are the broader trends in Asia, not just for consumers, but also for businesses, new businesses and existing businesses? We'd like to hear about that. So please welcome to the stage, Maya Hari.
Thank you. You made my job easier by talking about our mission and what's happening on Twitter. Thank you for having me here at the event. I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of the rise of digital society in Asia and the trends that are associated with it. There's no better time to be in Asia than now, it feels like. That's the emotion I carry when I compare my sentiment with my peers who run other regions. For Twitter, it feels like the canvas is very rich for innovation, for a lot of activity happening here. You know, we're as a region, we're expected to grow 5.5% this year, accounting for nearly 2/3 of the global growth, according to IMF, which is exciting. And the region remains the world's most dynamic by a considerable margin. What is also exciting is Asia really leading the digital revolution. Right, both as a consumer market as well as technology being built out of here. Last year, we had nearly 1.9 billion internet users in Asia, and that continues to grow at about 8% year on year. And you know, a large part of that region, 70% of users are expected to be really mobile, and this becomes a very on mobile and becomes a very big differentiator in a lot of what drives Asia versus the rest of the world. But within that, some of the interesting things, half of the millennials in the world will be in Asia by 2020. Half of the internet users, half of the social media users. And so clearly, if you need a cheat sheet on some demographic number around digital you need to plug in, half is in Asia, would be roughly safe to say. Right? But I think the one biggest trend there is the millennial usage or the millennial consumers. That demographic, in our view, actually drives a lot of separation of what happens in Asia versus the rest of the world. So the millennials in Asia are tech savvy, they're tech obsessed, they love science. And it's interesting, their consumption of everything digital and their lifestyle patterns actually are a driving force in catapulting a bunch of digital industries, right? We see this in commerce, just being able to discover and buy on mobile. The propensity to do that weekly by this millennial audience starts to show what happens in the commerce world. Same with payments, same with food delivery in this part of the world, and travel. The obsession to travel by these consumers is going to fundamentally change the number of jobs in travel we will see. 1 in 10 jobs in travel, 1 in 10 jobs in the region will be in the travel industry. To a large part because of this segment. One of the things that we see is based on the conversations we see millennials or audiences in general having on Twitter, it tends to define what they're interested in, what they're thinking about, and so we learn a lot from this. And the millennial consumer is deeply driven by purpose, by equality, and by concerns for things like environment, right? And this starts to pose some interesting trends for us to understand how business will evolve, right? So it's not uncommon for us to sort of see countries like India and China and millennials in this region care more about the environment because they're sort of living in a scenario where carbon footprint is really challenging. and caring for climate change and talking about action that they would like to contribute to is something that we see very often. This year has been an interesting year for equality, both from gender equality and really fighting women coming out, sharing their voices on trying to have an equal footing has been remarkable to see around the region, but also things like same-sex marriage and marriage equality becoming a big trend around Australia and Taiwan and India, and sort of that discussion and debate playing out on the platform we saw. But the other really interesting trend with the rise of millennials in this segment is also that they are pushing businesses to do the right thing. And they will vote with their dollars on who to buy. And they don't just buy a product or a service anymore. They buy what you stand for as a company. And that's an interesting change for industry to think about as these digital consumers who are heavily connected and talking publicly. How do you have a play and a say in that mindset of the consumer? But if you sort of step out of just that millennial segment and look wider, we also saw other trends play out. Asia accounted for more than half of the worldwide digital video viewing audience last year. So video as a format has essentially become the common currency now of communication. We sort of expect that it will surpass 1.3 billion viewers by 2020. So the numbers continue to grow there. Now within Twitter we see, that's the industry at large, within Twitter we see similar trends as well. Asia sort of continues to lead growth for the company globally and is rising in importance. And video consumption on Twitter as well mirrors that trend. Now, if you think beyond the native digital economy, you also have a large consideration of digital transformation of the traditional businesses. And we actually see that this will add about $1.6 trillion to Asia's GDP. And so that's a big consideration as well. We heard from the panel earlier talking a little bit about the banks and how they have to transform. But if you sort of take that wider lens, there's several industries there. A study from Microsoft and IDC actually expects that an incremental 1% of growth to Asia's GDP would come from this transformation, right? And so at that point, 60% of Asia's GDP will be derived from digital products and services. So this innate trend of consumers getting comfortable with technology sort of will have that ripple effect widely beyond the native digital economy. Now, this is all great. It's a strong outlook for Asia, and we love that, and it's a rich canvas. But there are some headwinds that our industry thinks about a lot, including some domestic market corrections. While China's had a fantastic growth, and it's been incredible to see, will we see some corrections there as we go? A shift towards the more protectionist policies. It's something that the digital economy thinks about a lot, and particularly, and I think Kiran sort of referred to this a little bit, fragmentation of the internet and the data ideologies of the world. The incredibly fast spread of the internet has traditionally happened because there's been one internet and you could scale things globally and across regions in a very fast way if you had the right product or service. And that is sort of getting heavily challenged now if the data ideologies play out differently. So that's something that we will as an industry sort of keep an eye on. The other interesting prospect for 2019 is election season is upon us in Asia. So we will have 5 countries in the region, Australia, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, all heading into elections. We will expect to see, greater digital diplomacy from governments, from constituents, from political parties. But also, there's an interesting trend around in Asia where there's a better digital bridge being built between consumers and governments for a really good outcome. flattening of bureaucratic processes has been great to see, and also better efficiency in adding value on a day-to-day basis to a consumer's life. So we do expect to continue to see that. We've seen some of that play out for very positive results in both India and Indonesia, and as well as mature markets like Singapore and Australia. So we expect that that will continue, and especially the elections tend to be, catalysts for more change in that space. As the Asian economy is becoming increasingly digitized, we see clear strengths emerging from the region. Artificial intelligence, Kai-Fu talked about that extensively. Mobile-first offerings, payments, which we heard a lot about, and commerce, particularly speed, agility, and engineering talent being strengths of the region. We continue to sort of see that play out to other areas, especially as we start to explore more deep tech beyond AI in this part of the world. And it's great to see sort of our homegrown entrepreneurial talents really emerge on the global stage in that sense. Now, this year, if you follow one sort of internet report globally, it tends to be Mary Meeker's report. I don't know if many of you see this. In our industry, we live by Mary Meeker's report. And for the first time, 9 out of 20 of the most valuable technology companies actually were Asian, all Chinese, but it has transformed significantly from a year or two ago. So we're nearly half and half in terms of the most valuable companies being American versus Asian. And it's interesting, we continue to see those trends grow. If you track the number of unicorns that come out of Asia, that and valuations are always subjective, so it's not an absolute metric, but you start to see the hotbed of Southeast Asia, India, and China really drive incredibly valuable homegrown companies coming out of here. We saw 3 industries in the last few years really come to a head: e-commerce, payments, and sharing economy. One of the things as we look forward is an interesting area that hasn't been solved yet is local language and localization. Because of the fragmentation of Asia, when Western companies have traditionally built all of the large services, they have not necessarily had to think first about the complexity of language. But now it's different, and especially if you are not just a Chinese company building for China, but an Asian company building for Asia, because you have some natural cultural strengths here, the language problem is not one that's easy to solve, and the ecosystem doesn't exist yet. So this is one area that we anticipate a lot of innovation to come around. You might see, if you take the DD app and use the DD app when you're in China, when you're traveling in China, you sort of can chat to your driver in your own language, and it automatically translates back and forth to Chinese. Now, imagine a world where that happens across services and across the internet, right? That could be a vision that may help solve some of the challenges that we have in the fragmentation of Asia. So that feels definitely like an area that we will see near-term innovation come out of, and definitely an opportunity that feels like it's unsolved. But above all of this, I think the opportunity is also Asia's a growing population, and how do we continue to connect more and more people to the internet? And the mobile-first opportunity is incredible. We see this with the mobile phone industry enjoying an incredible amount of growth coming out of Asia, and that's sort of helping drive connecting more populations into Asia. The final sort of area to think about is smart cities, smart nations, smart technologies also require smart conversation, as especially to connect and converse with digital natives. At Twitter, we think deeply about this because our purpose is to serve the public conversation. One of our fundamental beliefs is that if by enabling public and real-time conversation, we think the world can solve problems and needs very quickly because there's no information asymmetry. And that very much applies to how we think about, how the industry thinks about smart cities as well. Part of what we do is allow companies to talk to their customers and to the rest of the world, but potentially using technology to talk, between government and constituents or between cities and constituents. There have been great stories. There's a little town called Hun in Spain, which is one of my favorite stories, that has essentially every constituent, every citizen living in that, in that town, completely digitally connected to every service. And so they might report that, hey, there's a garbage can on the street. They will tweet that out. And literally within hours, the administration that's tracking everything digitally picks that up and moves the garbage can, posts a picture back, and says, hey, it's done. Have a nice day, right? It's a utopian world. Hun is a small town, less than 10,000 people, if I remember right. But it would be amazing to have certain levels of smartness as we continue to see cities become smarter and smarter. And we definitely see technologies continuing to enable that. As we go through this in Asia, it means sort of solving for multi-religions, multi-races, multilingual and multicultural communities, thinking about their sentiment, thinking about the cultural nuances adds incredible complexity to how to do this right. And this is something that I think the digital world and the digital industry has to learn quickly on how to do this, because you have to balance speed, which is native to the digital world, with doing it right. And that's a interesting trend on how the industry overall is learning to adapt. From our perspective, I think the goal to ensure that all sides of the conversation is always visible to the youth, from the youth to the business leaders, to policymakers, to personalities, is always a wonderful thing, because you're able to represent open and public discussion and debate around ideas that matter. So I'll wrap up with this, and I'll invite you all as co-captains of the industry to sort of look forward to collaborating and continuing this dialogue on what it will take to have one digital Asia as such. Thank you.